Hello, my name is Linda Churchill, and I'm a counselor with the Student Counseling Center, University of Manitoba. I have been facilitating loss and grief support groups with and for students for several years now. The topic of today's video is living after a loss. Those of you who have experienced the recent death of a loved one in COVID times know firsthand the hardship of grief in an era of pandemic restrictions. The pandemic has impeded our capacity to gather and to support one another as a community of family and friends. In many cases, it has impeded loved ones from visiting with sick and or dying family members or friends. It's been nothing short of heartbreaking. Now, grief was never meant to be endured alone or in isolation at the best of times, never mind COVID times. People heal in community, and now here we are trying to find ways to be community without being in proximity. I know we all look to the day when this is over and we can be together again without worries of infection spreading. Living after a loss can be challenging and deeply painful. I've heard loss and grief group participants describe their grief experience with terms like empty, sad beyond words, confused, angry, guilty, and more. In some cases, there is a mixture of sadness and relief, particularly when a loved one has suffered with a prolonged illness. The nature of our grief tends to be linked to the depth of our love and attachment with the deceased. And that's because love and grief are two sides of the same coin. Anyone who loves, and that's most of us, is vulnerable to grief. And grief is our mind and body adjusting to the reality and the enormity of the loss. And also, it is our way of learning to live without that person in person and beginning to learn to live with their memory, learning to form a new relationship with them in memory instead of in person, as well as shaping their legacy. I'll speak about that more in a moment. So even in COVID times, how do we go on living when a loved one dies? I like the quote, "Death ends a life, but not a relationship." For example, my grandparents, parents, and relatives who died either distantly or recently will always be my family members, even though they are no longer with us. Our loved ones will always be our loved ones, even after they die, and we will always be theirs. In his classic work, Grief Counselling and Grief Therapy, J. William Worden says that there are four main tasks confronting those who grieve. He uses the language of task, so we'll go with it. He says we must learn to, or must we, a task is to learn to accept the reality of the loss, and then to experience the pain of the loss, to adjust to the new situation, and then to reinvest in the new reality. So when we are actually journeying through grief, we are going back and forth within and amongst these tasks. It's not like we do this and then we do that. It's not sequential. We're usually going back and forth between the emotional experience of the loss, but then dealing with life as it unfolds. So in other words, I have a good cry and I also take out the trash. Now, by the way, many people think that if they have sudden grief bursts, it means that they're not dealing with their grief. There seems to be this prevailing myth that if you're not over it within some arbitrary time frame, you're not dealing. Well, that is false. Feeling is dealing. Every tear you shed, every memory you share, every expression you give is dealing. Now, there are healthy and unhealthy ways of dealing with grief. I'll get to the healthy part in a bit. Suffice it to say, a few unhealthy ways of dealing with grief, or perhaps lashing out at other people, perhaps drinking too much. I think we kind of know the difference between how we're dealing with ourselves in a healthy way or not a healthy way. Now, I've met with students, going back to this arbitrary timetable, I've met students grieving losses who state that their friends think that there's something wrong with them because perhaps they're so despondent about their loved one, their loss, just even after a few months of the death, after the death. And so after hearing them, I'll say something like, well, you're not sick, you're sad. And sadness is not pathology. There is no timetable for grief. It's normal and natural to be sad and grieved for quite a lengthy time after a loss, depending on the nature, again, of the relationship. So grief is very emotional. It is meant to be felt and not analyzed, and certainly not judged. We do our best healing in a climate of no judgment. Now, the reason why loss and grief support groups have sprung up over the years is because grief is lonely. It's a lonely, lonely journey. And many grieving people feel driven to find others who can really understand firsthand what it's like to go through it, where they can obtain not only understanding, a lot of empathy, and in a no judgment zone. We also discover in loss and grief support groups that we're not alone and we're not crazy. Grief can be such a roller coaster of emotions that can actually make people feel as though they are crazy. But when you think about it, if you didn't feel the impact of the loss of someone you love, it, what would that be? Robotic? We are human, and we are going to feel. Some people feel it right away, and some people, it takes a while for them, for it to hit them, the enormity, the reality, all part of the grief journey. And by the way, no two people grieve alike. We are rather like snowflakes. No two grieve alike. Everyone has their own way, their own style of grieving, mediated by things like personality, culture, introversion, extroversion, a host of variables. Everyone is different. I remember one loss and grief group participant saying that her grief felt like love with no place to go. Indeed, grief can feel like love with no place to go. So in a moment, I'll talk about ways one might channel love and grief. Now, a common thing when grief is relatively fresh, and I mean within the past couple of years or so, is fear. The death of a loved one brings up um, um, sort of face to face with mortality itself. And we might have morbid thoughts. We might wonder, well, who's next? We might find ourselves worrying excessively about more loss to come. Now, some tips to manage worry, which is really anxious thoughts teleported into the future. And it's like, oh, the scary future, right? So some tips to sort of come to terms with uncertainty is to enter more fully into the present moment. Our body is our friend in that regard. If you noticed, our breath is always in the present moment. We're plunked in the present moment physically. Our senses are in the present moment. We can't breathe yesterday's breath. We can't even breathe 5 minutes breath from now. So a way to step out of worry is to come into the present, to take a deep breath, to notice our immediate surroundings, and to remind yourself that in this moment, you and everyone else who's still alive is okay. Also, people find that remembering to control that which is within our control is important. Yes, there is much that is not within our control, and also there is much that is. Water the plants, wash the dishes, play some music, call a friend, take a walk, tend to that which you can control. Other tips to manage worry are called postponement, compartmentalization. They're similar in that they put you in the driver's seat of worry instead of worrying being in the driver's seat of you. For example, at my university office, this is my home office, I keep a jewel box. It's quite lovely. And I call it the worry box. And so pre-COVID, when students would come in and talk about their preoccupation with worries, getting in the way of their focus, getting in the way of their concentration, getting in the way of their productivity, I would give them a piece of paper and a pen and a surface to write on. And I'd say, for your eyes only, just scribble down in point form all things that are bothering you, that are clouding your mind right now, and that are taking you away from what you really need to do. And so that's what students would do, write it all down. And then I would say, now please fold that paper into the smallest bit that you can fold it into. They do that. And then I hold open the jewel box and I ask them to place in there. They do. I shut the jewel box, I put it on a shelf beside us, and then I say, okay, now what do you really have to tend to? And it's usually deadlines, it's usually studying, if there's a paper due, such is the life of a student. By the way, physical activity helps a lot of people too. Even if it's just going for a walk, doesn't have to be bodybuilding or anything, but physical activity can help people get out of their scary thoughts and into their bodies where they feel more empowered. By the way, learning to live without loss also encompasses basic health practices, decent sleep, good nourishing food, plenty of water, some exercise. Like my dearly departed grandmother used to say, your health is everything. Taking care of our health is part of learning to live beyond loss. And I encourage you to do this even if you don't feel like it. People tell me they never feel like exercising, but after they actually do, they feel enormously better. Now, I frame many emotional experiences in grief, such as guilt or anger, as dimensions of love. Examples of this are times I've heard people express guilt, feeling as though they could have done more, said more, anything to keep that person around. I recall many who could not visit their loved ones because of COVID restrictions. And they express guilt and say, I should have called more, I should have done more. Not all many students, we have students of all ages and stages of life. I remember a woman who was married to a big strapping man, very independent fellow whom she loved to bits. But he was the type of guy who just never went to the doctor, didn't do it. And then he got so ill that he had to go. And he was diagnosed with a fast-moving cancer, and he died very quickly, probably within a month or so of the diagnosis. And she said that one of the experiences of grief she had that was very predominant for her was guilt. I should have insisted that he go to the doctor. I should have insisted he'd gone for regular checkups. I should have dragged him into the car to do that. Anyway, as she continued to examine this guilt, she began to realize that what she was really saying was, my darling, I would have done anything to keep you around. I wish I could have done more to keep you around. So you see how guilt can be an expression of love. Not a very comfortable one, but an expression nonetheless. Many people find that they need to create new routines or make changes after loss. Of course, grief, loss does change us and will naturally have us change some of our routines. For example, students who always made a regular phone or video chat contact with loved ones far away, if a loved one who lives far away has died, they might instead, eventually over time when they're ready, keep a diary or a journal in which they write a note to that loved one, just to share the events of the day. Dear Mom, you'll never guess what happened today. You would have laughed so hard. Or perhaps they might create a memory table of photos and mementos of that loved one. Now, shaping the legacy of a loved one can prove quite helpful. We need to make meaning in our lives. lives. And I would argue that it's pretty hard to go through life if it feels meaningless. We humans actually are a meaning-making creature. So what does it mean to find meaning? I like David Kessler's definition. By the way, David Kessler is an American author and speaker and counselor on loss and grief. He has a website called it's called grief.com. I'll list various websites on this site. So he says finding meaning is essentially that which helps make sense of life events. The why to live is as important as the how. How do we make sense? Now, meaning making is a process, much like the grieving process itself. So as stated, love and grief are two sides of the same coin. So wherever we find love and follow the love, that's usually where meaning is to be found. Meaning is what we do after loss happens. Now, meaning making develops usually in kind of small ways. So for example, feeling gratitude for the time we had with our loved one is one way of meaning making. Another thing is finding ways to acknowledge our loss, but also finding ways to commemorate our loved one's life. It doesn't just happen at the funeral or memorial service or whatever other celebration or ceremony there is after a loss in one's culture. We might want to find other ways to commemorate that person throughout the year, particularly milestone events such as birthdays, high holy days, and so on. Finding ways to commemorate their life and our relationship with them. Finding other ways to honor their memory, recognizing even the value and fragility of life itself, and also the value of our relationships, taking nothing or no one for granted. When you think of it, we are all on loan on this earth. Meaning making is a choice, not a given. It's meant to help us learn to live with more love than pain. And I would argue that a healthy way of going through grief ideally takes us to that place where we can be living more fully with more love in memory of that person than pain. In my loss and grief support groups, I invite people to channel their love and grief by creating a life certificate. When they're ready, of course. No one is forced to do anything that they're not ready for. The life certificate is one way to recall aspects of their loved one's life story and to share that. Photos of their loved ones, mementos, photos of their loved ones with them and with other people with whom they were in relationship, other family members, perhaps friends. Not popular, but sort of treasured quotes from them, maybe recollections of their favorite songs, shows, pastimes, work, other aspects of their personality, what they appreciated about this person, but also what this person appreciated about them, what this person appreciated about you. What values, skills, or life lessons that loved one has passed along. That's where we get into legacy. What have they passed along to us that we will always treasure? How have they affected our lives for the better? And how do we want to live in honor of that person? And how we take care of ourselves when we miss them so much. We might even recall and share in this life certificate what hopes and dreams our deceased loved ones may have had for us. There are big and small ways to find and make meaning. Some parents who have lost their adult child who died in university might, for example, might establish a scholarship in loving memory. Some bereaved persons have found meaning by volunteering with organizations that help people in some way, or by planting a tree in loving memory. There are many ways to make meaning. There's a sort of famous example here in North America that of the founder of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, um, Candy Lightner, who lost her daughter to a drunk driver, channeled her deep pain and deep grief by lobbying for prevention campaigns and law enforcement so that lives could be saved, and parents spared such a nightmare of losing a child. We can, in our own way, gradually learn to live as our deceased loved one would have wanted us to live, fully, lovingly, and meaningfully beyond loss. Please know that healing grief is a very gradual process. If you're searching for ways to live beyond loss and need assistance in doing so, please contact the Student Counseling Center to discover more about our loss and grief groups and much more about our counseling and other programs. As I've said, I've listed on this site a number of websites that provide many helpful tips and tools. I wish you well as you learn to live after loss.